Hello, welcome to Artistic Spirit. It's Katie Moran, and today I have a very special guest. I'm here with Marcie Macari. She's a published author, speaker, registered orthomolecular health practitioner, and resiliency coach. Her resilience resume includes surviving every kind of abuse, nearly every natural disaster, a health condition that left her bedridden overnight and stole more than 10 years of her life, and being abandoned by a Christian ministry in Africa when she came out as a lesbian. She has been helping people heal themselves ever since her own health crisis and coaching people to harness their resilience to overcome the challenges they face, to bounce, not break. Marcie is the author of She Births, a modern woman's guidebook for an ancient rite of passage. Marcie speaks on topics of importance to women, entrepreneurs, the LGBTQ community, welcoming religious groups, and marginalized youth, all with a focus on resilience. Welcome.
Thank you. Lovely to be back.
You exemplify resiliency. What are your 5 tips for cultivating resilience?
I have sort of 5 tenets. One is to look up, sort of like when you are walking in a dark, during like sunset, and you can't really see where you're walking. If you look up past the horizon, then your eyes can adjust to what is before you, right? You can see better if you're not looking directly at it sometimes. So look up and past the place where you're feeling stuck. To stay curious, so always look for new information, new ways to evolve, new ways to improve yourself. Because when you feel stuck, sometimes that's the best place to grow. Reach out for support and assistance. That can be everything from therapists and religious leaders to friends who have gone through similar experiences, to give you some inspiration. I don't believe that everything happens for a reason. That's actually something I don't subscribe to, but I do believe you can make a reason for everything. So find the lesson. So look for where you are, look and see where your lesson is, something you can take away, something really valuable, like a gem, and then reinvent yourself. Reinventing yourself is something that I personally have lived my whole life by. And I love to see people sort of look at all of their different facets and then choose to make one come to the forefront so that they can move to a different part of their life. My friends kind of joke because one day I sat down and wrote out everything I've done for a living, anything I've done to make money, or like a side gig or an actual job or a business and I've had like 40 different things that I've done. And so in the creative community, that's not unusual, but it's important to, when you feel stuck in business, in earning money, sometimes in creative pursuits, to kind of look at what other part of yourself you can make the center of your focus and grow that part and move into a different part of life. So
Going deeper on that, how can artists, creatives, how can they find more resilience in creating?
I would say probably the inspiration points, like reaching out to others, is really important for creatives. Again, I think we mentioned this in our previous interview, that artists tend to become sort of focused on their own creation process, and reaching out and welcoming information, take a class, participate in a workshop, reach out to other artists and have a creative like times of some kind, like have a party and have everybody come and bring what they're working on, and like share information and resources and support with each other. I think that that's a really good way to get kind of moving past where you feel. As a writer, I get stuck too, right? I just suddenly, I'm like, I have all of these things I want on paper and I just don't have the words all of a sudden. And when I take like an online like gathering where we just write and we talk about what we're writing, that is often enough just to get me past that stuck feeling, because we get in our head, right? We're like,
Mhm.
oh, I'm stuck, I'm never going to finish this. What is the matter with me? I used to create like just fine 6 months ago, it was so easy, and today it's just not. We can get sort of in a loop. So if we're with other people that are also struggling and we can help them, and then we feel inspired by what they're doing, and then that helps us in return, definitely I would say reaching out to others for sure.
And what are the benefits, maybe just briefly, the benefits of creating to become resilient?
Creating to become resilient. So I think in some ways the creative process is a way to reinvent ourselves, because when we're creating something, we're always going through a process of metamorphosis.
Mm.
And so I would say that when we create something, especially if we're doing it from a place of healing and light, that can actually become a really powerful tool for us going into another challenge. We can hold on to the where we've come from, how far we've come, kind of mantra. And so we're faced something with something else, being stuck or being confused or lost. We can look at that thing that we have done, that change that we've made, the creation that we've created, and that can be an inspiration for us in the moment.
What was an important lesson you learned between the connection between creativity and resilience?
Well, I think that for me, creating something is often the way to facilitate resilience for myself,
Mm.
and probably that's
Mm.
true for other creatives as well. um, Sometimes when life, just regular life, gets difficult and I sort of get stuck in an area of relationship or job, or my cars are broken down or something, right? Like specific life things. Sometimes just sitting down and having a moment to create something and get the feelings out gives me sort of a clear mind about that. And then if you have a clear mind, it's much easier to find the ways you can be resilient in those moments. You're not clouded with a bunch of feelings.
I'd love to hear more about your story.
Okay.
Mhm.
So I'm going to sort of touch on just a few points. So the first one is that um, my story is complex, like a lot of life stories. I've been through a lot, I've seen a lot, and I would like to encourage anybody who comes from a difficult place, like a difficult start in life, that it is not about where you start, it's where you go. I was born to a drug addicted mom and an alcoholic father who was extremely abusive. And I basically survived that with some pretty serious trauma. Um, and then I was adopted. Well, then I went into a home with my birth father and a stepmother. And I have four siblings in that marriage, and they were my stepmother was religious, and kind of brought us into a fundamentalist Christian church. And so I started to be really drawn in by the concepts that were sort of being provided. I
Mm.
became a born again at 12, and I was going to be a missionary sure I was going to be a missionary at 12. And it was the kind of church where women were not allowed to speak unless spoken to. Men are always in charge, they're always the ones who make the rules. And you know being a virgin until you were married was super super important. I signed an abstinence pledge, purity pledge. And it was pretty intense. And I really learned, I think in retrospect, I learned how to be watchful, because I absorbed so much information at that time that when I was older and I started to process it, I realized what it was I was seeing. So now I'm much quicker to pick up on things that are dangerous or manipulative. I actually left the little hometown in Western New York, and got on an airplane and flew to LA, and I joined a professional theater ministry. So I actually lived on the road out of a backpack or a van for more than 5 years. And I performed more than 10,000 times in a variety of different settings. Some of that time was spent in South Africa. And before I actually was married at 19, and before I got married, I had an experience with a woman, and I really loved it.
Mhm.
But it was definitely at the time where I was in my headspace, it was not okay. It was seen as one of the worst sins a person could do. And so it just got pushed to the back of my memories, and I married a man, quickly got pregnant and had a baby. A baby was born in Africa. And I on the team that I was touring with in South Africa, there was a woman there who I developed feelings for, and it turned into something very quickly. And I was married at the time. So I told my husband that I was definitely gay and I needed to not be married. The ministry then said, well, we are not going to renew your work visa and we're not going to pay to fly you home. And we were living off of like $20 a week of pay. So there was no way. I couldn't now I couldn't get a job in the country I was stranded in, and I had my 14-month-old baby. So I actually I kind of wrap her on my back with a towel, like the beautiful African artisans that I was selling my wares next to at the farmers market. They always thought it was very interesting, this little white face sitting next to them with my, handmade, hand painted greeting cards. And I sold those greeting cards to people at the farmers market. I traded it for food. I took it to florists and asked them to put them in their store. And that's really the first foray that I had in entrepreneurship and in it being like a creative entrepreneurship. And I think that's kind of where I got the bug. And I was in business for myself and doing creative things for more than 30 years. And this is still creative, but it is a different kind of creative. And then I actually ended up, I could get home, but that was only through the generosity of somebody who got a large sum of money from the government and flew me home. And that was more than, it was about a year and a half of living sort of not knowing what to do, in that country.
Mm.
It was actually quite frustrating, sort of scary, because the person that I had formed a relationship with turned out to be extremely physically violent. And I had no idea that that was the case. And she actually attempted to unalive me. And I couldn't go to the authorities because being gay was not protected. So I had no way to protect myself, no way to leave the country. And because my ex-husband at the time was still in the ministry, he was concerned that I would leave the country with our daughter. So he was holding my passport. Now, that would probably be fine because I couldn't get home anyway, except that where I was, the authorities would make regular checks to make sure nobody was hiding people, smuggling people. So they used to come to the door and they would come and like inspect the apartment. And so my daughter and I had to hide in the bottom of closets because we had no ID. There was no way to prove who we were. And I was so scared that I would be taken to jail and separated from my daughter. And it was super, super scary. But I got home and got a divorce. And my family couldn't deal with the fact that I was gay. It was very, very hard for them to wrap their mind around. And basically, they disowned me. I mean, they wouldn't put it in those words, but that's essentially what happened. And it was very difficult being back in the country without any sort of no support and no foundation.
Mm.
And there was a couple that I knew from being in the ministry who were childless. They'd always wanted to have children, they just couldn't. And I lived with them for a little while, and I started calling them mom and dad just because that's how they were being to me. And then when I was 24, they asked me to let me be adopted by them. So they actually adopted me, and I have legal parents, like adoption certificate and everything, at the age of 24. And people always say, but why would you need that as an adult? And I say, like, it doesn't matter how old you are. Everybody needs a soft place to land. And they provided that for me. They were supportive of LGBTQ people. My mom is a Methodist pastor. She's very progressive. In fact, she took an early retirement when her church rescinded support of LGBTQ marriage. She was like, my daughter is gay and I can't be a part of an organization that is not going to support her right to marry. And I thought that was very lovely. So when I was living with my parents, I got real sick. I had what seemed like a cold, and I came back from a night out, and I went to sleep, and I woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning, and the room was spinning so hard that it felt like I was in a centrifuge, and it didn't stop for 10 years. Doctors couldn't help me. I went from being very active. I was a salsa dancer, I was a gymnast, I was super active, to not being able to even walk to the bathroom, literally overnight. Um, there is nothing more disconcerting than suddenly not being able to function normally, right?
Mhm.
Um, and it was very frustrating because I was only 28 when that happened. 28, yeah, I think it was 28, around there. um, I was, you know, I was young and I was supposed to be vibrant. And, at that point I had two children. And, oh, I forgot to say, when my family disowned me, I went back in the closet. So I was married a couple more times to men, in an attempt to, maybe I was just having the wrong guys. Like maybe I need a different guy. Maybe that's what's the problem. So yeah, it didn't work out that way. But I had two children, and I couldn't take care of them because there was just no way to function. And I would go to a doctor, and all of them, they would check me out and they would say, "You are the healthiest sick person we've ever seen." And they'd like pat my knee with their hand and be like, "You're just doing too much, dear." And really, that's all the help they gave. And I went to every specialist. I went to like the Dizzy Clinic in Toronto, which is it's like world renowned research for vertigo. And they couldn't even help me. It was very strange. So I actually found that if I sat very still and I held a book in front of my face and moved the book like this so that I didn't have to turn my head, I could read slowly. So I actually studied orthomolecular health practitioner, the orthomolecular health practitioner program at the Edison Institute of Nutrition. It's a 3-year program. I finished it in a year, and I graduated with first class honors. And I realized that I was exhibiting all the symptoms of toxic mold exposure. So I moved out of the house, left everything I owned behind. Anything I took had to be wrapped in plastic for like 6 months. It was ridiculous because mold spores get in everything. So we were living in a church parsonage. That's where my parents were living. And about 6 months, I moved away and I started to feel slightly better. And then
Mhm.
I sought treatment like with chiropractors, and I went to a holistic nutritionist myself for a while. Took some things. I had to stop being a vegan and move into having eggs and beef because those are the only things that will pull mold out of your body. So basically, I healed myself, and I'm like 98% better. I have a bad day from time to time, but I'm functional. And it was funny
Mhm.
because my mom called me about 6 months later and said, "Hey honey, your dad and I are moving out of the parsonage for a little while. We have to go live in a hotel." And I was like, "Why?" And she was
Mhm.
like, "Well, they did an inspection and apparently we've got black toxic mold." And I said, "What wall?" And she was like, "The one your bed is next to." I was like, "Yeah." And in that house, like, she was diagnosed with a pseudo tumor and fibromyalgia. My father was having a bunch of health problems, and we just didn't know. It was one of those kind of strange things. But New Jersey's has a very high mold problem. So that was in New Jersey. So yeah,
Mhm.
so when people come to me for help, as a practitioner, I'll take on clients, and I generally take on clients that have tried everything else and they just haven't really found relief, or people aren't believing them, or they're not able to they're like not able to find the answers that they're looking for. And then I approach it from a whole person standpoint, and we work through different phases of healing themselves. And I find that because I understand what it feels like to not have answers and to be so despondent that they have like your whole life affected. I can relate to them in a way that a lot of doctors just are not able to. And so I can provide them at least some empathy at the same time that I'm helping them to make better choices for whatever their, concerns and issues are. Um, so yeah, so I mean, there's so many times in my life, like the health thing, the, abuse as a child thing. I have found myself in some toxic relationships as an adult, as people who have unhealed childhood wounds often do. And I mean, it's great if you know what's happening, because you can go seek support to heal those things so that it doesn't ever happen again. But
Mm.
until you realize that that's why you're being drawn into those relationships, it can be very confusing. Um, so I would say that, between surviving abuse, overcoming health, um, pretty serious health problems, and some of the challenges I've had with, like, as a person who owned several different businesses, my last long-term business was, I owned a gluten-free, sugar-free bakery, which worked well with my health philosophy.
Mm.
and and I actually am, I did really well, but then COVID hit, and I limped along for a while. I moved the bakery from Canada to the US, and it was doing fine. And then at the end of COVID, the gas prices like spiked really high, and everything went up. The cost of packaging, cost of ingredients, everything just went so high. And I couldn't cover overhead with the costs of production. So I ended up going out of business. And that was a really difficult experience for me. And it was in those moments I had to reinvent myself, right? Like, you get to the point where you are like, I don't know what's next. This is what I've been doing for 15 years. Like, I don't know what to do now. And being able to kind of look at what I have to offer, who I am, wanting to serve in the next phase. I was able to find a job. I actually teach culinary arts to developmentally disabled adults, and that's my day job, and I love it. It's challenging but lovely. I got to basically develop all of the sort of training tracks, and I teach that during the day, during the week, and there's nothing more beautiful than seeing, how these individuals are so resilient in and of themselves. It's really inspiring. So yeah, it's just sort of a little overview of some of the things I've been through.
Yeah, I think about how much you've overcome and this idea of having courage. And looking back, did you feel like every time you had to reinvent yourself, it took courage?
um yes, I also think that there's a certain amount of, there's sort of like, it is courage, but it's also a belief in something better, right? Like,
Mm.
it's holding on to the belief that something better is coming. There was a study done. I have to look up the reference for this because I love this study. I read it recently. I think it was at Harvard, but this, and for animal lovers, you might want to skip this part. Sorry, but it's very fascinating science. But they took, I believe it was rats, and they put them in a pool, and they let them swim until they died. And what they did was they timed how much time that took. Then they took rats, put them back in, let them swim, and then just before the time would have run out, they took them out, dried them off, gave them something to eat. And that time was, I think it was like 12 minutes, right? That was like how long it took for them to not be able to survive swimming, trying to swim. Then so they would take these rats out just before the 12 minutes, dry them off, give them something to eat, put them back in the pool. Guess how long they could swim then? It was ridiculous.
A
It,
lot longer is my guess.
yes, it was like 12 hours or something. Like, it was a mind-blowing number of
Wow.
amount of time. And the reason is because the rats had experienced hope. So because they had experienced hope, they were always believing that something good was going to happen, that something better was going to like occur, like they were going to be saved. And I think that's sort of something that I have lived by, is that I always believe that past the dark, there is something beautiful waiting, whether that's something that I'm learning or some kind of a new experience for myself. I always believed that there was something better. And I think that that's a really important takeaway for people who are walking through difficult life like phases, because we
Mm.
get to a point where if you're going through a divorce or you've lost your job and you don't know what's next for you, you can look at it two ways. You can look at it like the end of something I really loved is happening, and you can grieve that, totally normal. But you can also say, this is a sad loss, but it opens the door and makes space for something else, something beautiful and new that I could not have had otherwise. And I think that that's always been something that has driven me, is that right at the end of something, I'm always excited for and looking up in, look, seeking something new and hopeful. I actually have a little saying that I say that hope is love's supple sister, because if we can align ourselves with hope, she's real pliable. She can get us through really difficult things and help us to navigate and stay hopeful, faithful,
Mm.
believing, positive thinking or whatever into something better. So
Yeah, I'm just really curious. What do you, and this comes up always on my podcast, this idea of, I always ask people if they think it takes courage to overcome things, and they always say, I wouldn't call it courage, and I never know where the disconnect is. So I think it's really interesting that you said you would call it the hope of a better future rather than courage. How do you see the difference between having hope and having courage?
I think courage, the word courage to me is a short-sighted word. So it's more like, in this moment, I believe I can overcome this thing in front of me,
Mm,
where hope says, I believe in future moments, I will overcome whatever is coming. Right. Like
mm,
it. So they're
mm,
both, I think, important, because one spurs you to action immediately and the other is sort of a longer burn. Right. Yeah.
mm, mm. That's very interesting. Um, when you think about resilience, what do you think people get wrong?
Mm. I think that people believe that if you're going to be resilient, you have to not grieve, that you have to not experience sadness or sit for a minute in the loss. I think that people think, well, if I'm going to bounce, I got to bounce, and there's no time at the bottom. You can't stay at the bottom, and that can actually create a false set of emotions where we are denying our humanity, denying ourselves the ability and the time that we need to really thoroughly learn from and process that hitting bottom. So I think that sometimes people think that if you're going to be resilient, you have to always be strong, you have to always be positive, you have to always be, capable of overcoming. And I would say that you yes, you have to be strong and positive and capable of overcoming, but you can't necessarily do that authentically without also processing some of the harder emotions like grief and loss, right? So
Mm,
I would say that that's probably the number one thing. Oh, and the other thing I would say about resilience, sort of something people don't understand, is that they think that resilience means bouncing back, but I think that resilience means bouncing forward. So
mm,
I think that although resilience can be like, if you lose your teaching position, it could be coming back into another teaching position. If that's where your calling is, great. But I think that that's pretty rare. I think people who truly are resilient find themselves catapulted into another new thing that they weren't expecting. So I would say that's the other fallacy, in my opinion.
that's really interesting. What would you consider, like, if you had to put a word or a concept to it, if bouncing forward is resilience, what would bouncing back be?
Oh, that's a good question. Um, I would just say it's a comeback. Like you're
Mm,
making a comeback, where
mm.
resilience to me is a movement forward. Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, it's really interesting because when you say about going forward, I think when I conceptualize resilience, I was thinking about it the other day and I was like, well, I think resilience looks different for everyone. So like in that, it's like a unique picture. But what are the things that are common themes when like kind of like in every picture that would be characterized as resilience? And I think as a starting point, you said like bouncing forward, but are there any other things you would categorize as that?
The find the lesson is really important. So
Ooh.
looking at what occurred in your situation that you do want to repeat or you do not want to repeat, and sort of making a conscious mental note of that. Particularly when we're talking about things about relationships, it's very easy to get blinded by that like new relationship energy that happens with the
Mhm.
next relationship. And it's important to have done to sort of taken stock, right? You got to do sort of your own um like yeah, taking stock where you sit down and you go, these are the things I noticed about this toxic relationship or this negative
Mhm.
situation that I do
Mhm.
not want to repeat going forward. How did I contribute? How did they contribute? How can I learn from what I contributed, and grow as a person and to evolve into a better partner for the next person? But then also, what are we looking for in the next relationship, and how is it different, now that we're bouncing forward from where we were before? um, I would say definitely the find the lesson is super important, and staying curious is probably the other one, because I feel like if we're always asking questions and we're always seeking to learn and to know and to understand ourselves and our world better, the knowledge that we gain from hitting bottom is so valuable that it's like it's like you hit bottom, but you're given a diamond at the end of the hit, at the end of the fall, right? So you have an opportunity to collect all of these things and then make something beautiful of it. Where if you choose not to find the lesson or look around and learn about yourself and the situation, really you can't experience the richness of the point of the fall, right? So yeah, I feel like those are probably the things I would say most are, as far as for people who are resilient, those are the ones that are most common themes.
What do you think for the relationship between boundaries and resilience is?
Hmm. So it depends on what we're talking about. So if
Mm.
we're talking about um, work or relationships, those are two of the bigger sort of areas of life where we might need to have resilience. And I think both of them require different kinds of boundaries. So
Mhm.
we have to know within ourselves what we want, what our needs are, and what we're bringing to the table. And we need to really be able to grasp that saying what we will and will not do is not a it's not an offensive behavior. It's actually useful information for a healthy person, or a good boss, right? Like if you need to say to your boss, I'm available during my work hours, but I'm no longer available by text after work hours unless I'm going to be paid overtime, because it takes away from quality of life in my other areas of life. um, Having that conversation with your boss may be difficult, but for a boss who is a good boss, they will respect that and they'll understand and they'll appreciate that you have been forthcoming with something that you needed in order to be happy as an employee, right?
Mhm.
If it's not a good boss, that's a great way to find out, and an excellent opportunity to start looking elsewhere. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What about in relationships? Specifically, what have you learned about boundaries, um, as you've like developed resilience and as you coach people through resilience? Like what are kind of like the things that you see when you think about the word boundaries that maybe someone who hasn't had that experience wouldn't see?
I think for people who want to focus on being resilient, one of the bigger themes that comes through that is a desire to be strong, to be stronger.
Mm.
And
Mhm.
I would say that for women, especially, we sort of think of strength in sort of a male way, which doesn't really apply to feminine energy. So for women, we look at strength as being like physically strong or like bold and brash and stating what we are and who we are, and sort of like that makes us strong. But really, um for feminine energy, sometimes I think that we can be strong mentally and psychologically in ways that are not as common with masculine energy.
Mm.
And so when we approach a relationship and we need to um, demonstrate strength, some of the best ways to do that is through the use of boundaries, clearly communicated, kindly communicated, and then upheld, right? Like we have to hold those boundaries and do it in a way that is loving to ourselves. One of the biggest themes that I have learned is about not abandoning ourselves, which can happen very quickly in relationships, especially if you're an empath. You can give of yourself to such a degree that you lose yourself in the relationship and sort of in service to the other person, and become permissive in ways that you wouldn't ever want, like your daughter to be permissive or your mother to be permissive. And so I think looking at how we would want the people who are closest to us to be treated, and then communicating those boundaries for ourselves, helps us to stay true to ourselves and to not abandon ourselves in those moments.
Yeah, I think this idea that strength can be seen in the boundaries we place is really powerful and almost a cultural shift, because I think there's this unhealthy narrative that strength comes from taking on more and from just like even like in working, like grinding culture, or in relationships, like the more you love someone, the more supportive you are, the more unconditional your love is. And this idea, especially for women, is that we have to take on more. We have to take on the burdens of other people, and that shows how strong we are, rather than this
Mm-hmm.
idea that it's what we choose not to take on and the boundaries that we do place and enforce, that shows strength. So I'd love to hear like a little bit more about that, because I think that's something, and you could talk about it like whether in like relationships or work. How how do you see that as like a cultural shift that I think like you're a voice for?
So I feel like there's two things going on. So
Hmm.
there is a concerning issue, is that women have not really been addressing their wounds from like years and years of having no boundaries or being
Hmm.
abused or whatever the case may be. And so when you don't address those things, you try to stay busy, so you tend to take on projects and things to do at work, and you don't, you'll do all the things for your family and your partner, and you'll just never sit down and never, because the process of sitting with yourself can be very painful. And so I would say, first of all, that if you find yourself taking on everything, if everything's a yes for you, because the thought of being quiet and being still is problematic, that's something that needs to be looked at. Um, the second thing is that absolutely women have been told from the Bible, even like Proverbs 31 is like, this woman is amazing and these are all the things she is. And, it sets us up to believe that we will be always ever present for our children. We will be always willing to give of ourselves and sacrifice anything for our children and our husband. That, if our church congregation or our family or friends group needs something from us, good women will say yes and do that. When in reality, we would never expect men to behave that way.
Hmm.
We take that burden on ourselves. And part of that's the nurturing element of feminine energy. But I also believe strongly that if we are going to address some of the disconnect we have from our feminine energy, some of the young people that I have, worked with, it's been really sad and shocking to see the girls, the young women, and how disconnected they are from their feminine selves, because femininity is seen as weak, when in reality females are very strong, and it is demonstrated by how much we have been carrying for so long. But that isn't a virtue. Carrying everybody else's burden is not a virtue. What is a virtue is taking on the things we can do lovingly and with an appropriate boundary, and allowing other people, trusting other people to handle some of their own things because they're adults, because they're children who are learning about being an adult, because we are not responsible for everything in the world. you know and it's actually a virtue to show our children balance, because balance is the key. Like, love, give of yourself, be generous, but also love yourself, be generous to yourself, because you first, right? Like, you have to fill your own cup, and then you have love and generosity to give to others, because it's very unlikely that you're getting your cup filled elsewhere. That's just the nature of the deal.
Mm. I'm curious, is there anything that's important to know about resilience that we haven't covered so far?
I would say that resilience does not happen in the absence of fear.
Hmm.
That sometimes being resilient means addressing fear as a helpful companion, but not a reason to not take the leap, to not make the decision, to not move forward. Fear is probably always going to be present in those people who are always trying to learn about themselves and grow and change, because anytime there's change, our brain tries to protect us, right? so
Hmm.
so fear will be present, but fear is not, it's not an indication that you shouldn't move forward, as long as you have use both your heart and your brain. um that the fear can be present, and it can just be a helpful, like I said, a helpful companion, and not a reason not to um to let yourself be propelled forward.
Hmm. I found it really interesting when you talked about curiosity and resilience. Could you speak more to that?
Sure. So when we hit rock bottom, so what people like to say, you know, you're kind of in a new position, right? You were up here, now you're down here, and it's an opportunity to observe, to take a minute and say, what led me here? How did I end up here? Is there something I could have done differently? Is there somebody I maybe trusted when I shouldn't have trusted them? Did I, like, not do good at my job? Did I do really great at my job and it has nothing to do with me? Like, you really need to analyze what got you there, and then learn like, start to let yourself be curious about those reasons. Like, okay, so if I trusted this person who pulled the rug out from underneath me, and now I fell from here to here, if from this position I can see that person from a different angle, what do I know about that person and also myself that allowed me to trust that person? Right? Am I naive? Am I not paying attention to red flags? Am I um too sort of excited about prospects to pay attention to what's actually happening? Like, learning about yourself so that the next time you encounter a new person who is wanting to be a business partner or a life partner or some kind of a connection that would be helpful to you, you'll be able to look at that situation differently. It's an opportunity to learn. Curiosity part comes when you learn about yourself and about how you may have contributed to where you ended up, and how others around you have contributed to where you ended up.
That's really interesting. So I think a piece of this that I really want to explore is this idea of trusting the wrong person and having it feel like betrayal. Like how do you, in terms of resilience, find the lessons that are truthful, that are useful, and doing that without it being detrimental to either your self-talk or how you see yourself. Like, say, you you tell yourself, oh, I must have been naive. Like, how do you avoid kind of like these common traps of judging ourselves instead of letting curiosity take the front seat?
Mm. So yeah, so the way that we speak to ourselves is super important, and I would say that when you're doing the staying curious or the finding the lesson, it's really important to be as neutral, as pulled away from the situation, observant as you can be, trying to not place judgment on yourself. I mean, you're already in a difficult situation at that point, and talking negatively about and to yourself is not going to assist in getting past it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would say that um, it's an opportunity to glean from what you're experiencing things that will truly assist you going forward. So you can say, I was really naive about that person. You could also say, I have a great capacity for trust. And I'm going to be more
Mm-hmm.
careful with that going forward. I'm going to do my due diligence before I give that gift away. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So one of those is negative, like I'm so naive. And the other says, I know about myself that I'm super trusting. And so going forward, I'm going to honor that with being more careful. So there are different ways to say the same thing, but our one is a, like a negative mental trap, and the other is a hopeful like gift that you're giving yourself in that moment.
Yeah, this is very interesting for me, and I think the audience will relate to this, but this idea that when does the curiosity stop and the lesson come in? Like, is there like a feeling, or is it like something that moves you forward? Like, how do you know that it's like you found the lesson rather than kind of like just this just this sense of curiosity that feels like it never stops? Like where is the line between curiosity and getting a lesson, or is it something that is always in flow and fluid?
Well, I hope we never stop being curious, because that
Mm,
is the thing that encourages us always to evolve, and people who are evolving are the most interesting people, right?
mm,
um, but I would say that just like a seed in the ground, you know, it just knows when it's coming to the toward the light. Like you
mhm,
sort of have,
mhm,
it's, I think that we have a sort of a job to do when we've hit bottom, and that's to open ourselves up to learning and to being curious about ourselves and the situation we're in. But I think at some point you get sort of revelations like, oh,
mm,
I didn't even think
mm,
about that. You know, that really speaks to me. And those are the lessons. So the curiosity is more like a choice you're making to
mhm,
seek, where
mhm,
the lessons, I think, sort of just occur at the times that you need to have them.
mhm,
Our job at that moment is to integrate the lessons. So
mhm.
we can have a whole list of amazing things we've thought of, but unless we choose to implement them, then they'll only just ever be words on a page, right? So learning to implement them and really focus on those things going forward, I think is super key to resilience.
What's an example of implementing them?
Well, let's talk about the naive one, right? So
Mhm,
I'm in this situation. Let's say this is fake, but let's just
mhm,
pretend like I had a business partner, and then
mhm,
they embezzled all my funds, right?
mhm,
So now I have nothing, and I have to start over, and I have all these debt collectors, and I'm super anxious and stressed.
mhm,
My job is to look up. I'm going to look up to so I'm going to trust that even though I don't have the answers in this moment, I'm going to focus up higher than my current situation and believe that there's something else so that I can see this situation a little more clear. I'm not getting stuck, right? Then I'm going to think about what my contributions were, what their contributions were. I'm not going to take responsibility for their actions. So I'm not going to say it was my fault that they embezzled the money because I'm so naive, because that is not the case. It is their responsibility that they embezzled the money. It has nothing to do with my trusting them. But I can say, I know about myself now that I am very quick. I have a great capacity to love. I have a very quick desire to love, and I have a very big capacity to not to love, to trust. And so we're in business. We're not loving. We're trusting. And so,
mhm,
like, I have a big capacity to trust. And so, going forward, I'm going to make sure that I get more references, that I spend more time with these people that I want to be in business with, so I know their character. I'm gonna put, maybe less emphasis on their resume and more emphasis on their character as a human, so that
Mm-hmm.
when I'm in business with them, our our uh, ethics are in alignment, our morals are in alignment. um, and so that would be a way to implement the lesson, which is that I'm super quick to trust, and maybe, I want to be careful with that gift going forward. So the next time I'm going to do this instead, right? Instead of just reading a resume and hiring somebody, I'm going to get to know them as people before they're hired.
I'd love to hear what are some tangible tools that can help people in the resilience process? Like, for example, like journaling, things like that. Like, what are kind of like the tangible tools?
Sure. So I love journaling. I also am a big fan of watercolor painting, using if you know the color wheel, and the if you take the if you take the chakra colors, um, and you put them on a wheel, and then you do the opposite color. It's like a it's hard to explain. Like, there's a wheel that you can find
Mm,
it online.
mm,
So if you take those colors and you determine, for example, with this sort of analogy that we're using, my heart chakra may be involved in this because I am very hurt that this person could have embezzled from me, right? So then I would take, I think it's red and green, or the heart chakra, like I forget the colors, but you would take the
mm,
chakra color and then its opposite balancing color on the color wheel, and you would paint with those colors, and it gives you something to put up on the wall, and you can meditate on it, so that you are using color therapy, you're using creative therapy, and it gives you sort of a focal point, right? So that's a tool that I use to kind of get people unstuck. Another one is lists. I'm a big list lover. So pros and cons, things like, how you're feeling versus what you're thinking,
mm,
things that you can tangibly look at. I'm a big fan
mm,
of getting things out of our head and onto
mm,
paper, whether that's in writing or in art. I'm really, or photos even. I'm a real big fan of being able to visually take in what our mental processes are doing, so that
mm,
we can process it in a different part of our brain. Um, I would say too, if you are religious or spiritual, reaching out to those people and doing some kind of counseling or therapy or group, Bible like groups, or
mm,
meditation groups or yoga, those kinds of things where you're in community with other humans while you're grieving, especially, is can be really, really helpful. I mean, I'm a big advocate of moving, put on some
mm.
music and boogie, you know, take a walk. I'm a big fan of playlists, putting certain music together in a certain order that helps you move through an emotion or boosts your feeling of courage in that moment. What we do with music is pretty phenomenal now. So yeah.
I loved all of this so much. Thank you so much for coming on
It
today.
was so much fun. Thanks for having me.